So there's that. Now, kagaya nga na napasadahan natin kanina, there are 4 core attributes of a corporation. Of course, no? Number 1, it's an artificial being. Like a partnership, it has separate and distinct personality. Next one, of course, it's a creature of law, not a creature of consent. Next, like I discussed earlier, a corporation has the right to succession. And finally, a corporation has the powers and attributes conferred by law or incident to its existence. Yung sinasabi ko kanina na express, implied, and incidental powers. Now, let us discuss these characteristics in more detail. A corporation is its own person. Like a partnership, it is an artificial being. A corporation, kagaya nga nung pinakita sa video ni Thought Monkey, it is not only, no, a corporation is not only a group of persons. It is its own entity with its own rights, with its own prerogatives, and with its own obligations. A corporation can own properties like a partnership can, no? 'Di ba? Yung sinasabi nga natin yung partnership properties na hindi pagmamay-ari ng sino mang partners, ang may-ari yung partnership. So for example, si Endless Waltz yung partnership, merong property or properties na nakapangalan kay Endless Waltz. Ganon din sa korporasyon, no? Like for example, kung may lupain ng SM, no? Ang SMIC, yung premises ng MOA. Hindi yun pagmamayari ni Henry C. Pagmamayari yun ng korporasyon. No? It is owned by the corporation. Kapag kinalkal mo yung titulo nun, of course, dahil may titulo yun, nakapangalan yun sa SM. Because a corporation can own properties in its own name. And its properties are not the properties of its stockholders, not the properties of its directors, and not the properties of its officers. This can be found in the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Wise versus Mansong Lung, an old case, no? Also, by virtue of its separate and distinct personality, a corporation can incur obligations. And just like in a partnership, the obligations of a corporation are not the obligations of its stockholders, directors, and officers. Kaya babalikan ko ulit yung tanong kay Endless Waltz, di ba? Hindi hangga't nabubuhay pa yung partnership, no? Doon sa midterms natin, 'di ba? Hangga't nabubuhay pa yung partnership at si partnership yung may utang sa iyo, kay partnership ka maniningil. And as long as hindi terminated yung partnership, as long as dissolved pa lang siya at pwede mo pa siyang singilin, siya yung kakasuhan mo. Ganon din sa korporasyon. Any obligations of the corporation are distinct from the obligations of its stockholders, of its directors, and its officers. Now, no, in the same way that the corporation can perform or can be bound to its own obligations, ganon din sa rights, no? Rights that belong to the corporation cannot be invoked by the stockholders, even if they own a substantial majority of the shares in that corporation. Anong ibig sabihin nito? Kung ang korporasyon ay may-ari ng isang lote, hindi pwedeng puntahan yun ng isa sa mga miyembro ng board of directors tapos tatayuan niya ng kanyang personal na bahay. Because it is only the corporation which can exercise the rights of ownership with regard to that property. I would hope na pag-aralan nyo naman sa LAW103 yung acts of strict dominion, acts of ownership, no, na napasadahan din naman natin sa partnership, 'di ba? Yung right to use, no, right to abuse, right to dispose, etc., etc. If a property is in the name of a corporation, it is only the corporation and none other that can exercise any right belonging to an owner or pertaining to an owner as regards that property. Hindi porke ikaw yung stockholder na may majority share. Sabihin natin, oh, bumili ka, mahilig ka bumili ng stocks, no? Ang dami-dami mo ng share sa sabihin natin sa BDO kaya sa Jollibee. Yan yung mga bullish no? Mga laging matataas yung value ng mga stocks niyan. Sabihin natin naging majority stockholder ka ng Jollibee. Pwede ka bang pumasok doon sa isa sa mga branches doon at sabihin doon sa manager na bigyan mo ako ng bakit majority stockholder ako ng Jollibee? You can't do that. Because rights that belong to the corporation can only be invoked by the corporation. Okay? Next, no? Ito yung sinasabi ni Thought Monkey kanina. Corporations are entitled to a number of constitutional rights. It has the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, meaning hindi pwedeng pasukin ng kahit ng mga pulis o ng mga sundalo ang premises ng isang korporasyon kung wala siyang search warrant. Okay? So a corporation has the right against unreasonable searches and seizures na normally na-avail lang ng ordinaryong tao, ng natural persons. But a corporation as a juridical person also has this right. And yun nga, it also has the right to due process, which includes the right to equal protection. Hindi ko na uulitin, di ba? Yung basis ng right to equal protection in the United States context na kinopya lang natin dito sa Pilipinas. But notwithstanding that very loaded, that very unique origin based on racial inequity, racial inequality, no? Ang ending, ang korporasyon meron ding ganung karapatan. But of course, no, hindi lahat ng constitutional rights na nakalagay sa ating Bill of Rights available sa isang juridical person kagaya ng korporasyon. There are certain things that a juridical person cannot do due to lack of a physical body. A corporation cannot appear in court as itself, di ba? Because a corporation has no body. No physical body anyway. And therefore, sino ang mag-a-appear in court if a corporation is impleaded in a case? It is a representative of the corporation, no? Armed with what? A special power of attorney. Okay? So, yan ang mag-a-appear in court on behalf of the corporation. At dahil nga walang katawan ang korporasyon at hindi niya kayang mag-appear in court as itself, all the more na hindi niya kayang pumunta sa witness stand at mag-testify. A corporation has no mouth, it cannot speak. It can only speak through its authorized agent or agents. So for the corporation, kung may kailangang mag-testify, di kung sino man yung authorized person. At dahil nga, related to that, dahil nga hindi nga kayang mag-testify ng korporasyon para sa kanyang sarili, hindi niya pwedeng i-invoke yung right to self-incrimination. Right against self-incrimination rather. Di ba? Mapansin niyo yan. I'm sure napapanood nyo naman yan before, no, sa mga congressional hearings. Pag merong sensitibong tanong or kung merong tanong na ang sagot lang, ang posibleng sagot lang yung pinagtatanungan would end up admitting to the crime or to the charge, di ba? Ang sasabihin yan, bubulungan niya ng abogado, tas ang sasabing sagot, Your Honor, or kung sa Senate yan, Mr. President, kasi Senate President, di ba? Mr. President, I invoke my right against self-incrimination. Kasi karapatan yon ng natural person. No? Hindi ka pwedeng pilitin ng anumang hukuman, ng anumang tribunal or grupo o ng sino man sa pamahalaan na magsabi ng anumang bagay na makakasama sa'yo. Even if you're actually the one who did the bad thing. No? For example, kung in an accused, no? With regard to an accused in a criminal case, sabihin natin for serious physical injuries, alam mo sa sarili mo na ikaw naman talaga yung nambugbog. May mga nakakita sa'yo. Ngayon, no, tinatanong ka ng piskal, ng prosecutor, you are being cross-examined. At ang line of questioning niya is wala ka talagang choice kundi umamin na oo, ako nga. Pwede mong sabihin na I invoke my right against self-incrimination because that's your constitutional right. But because a corporation is a juridical person, it has no body, it has no presence. It cannot be made to testify. Therefore, it has no right against self-incrimination. There are limits, ha? Remember, there are certain limits to a corporation. Now, meanwhile, a corporation can be held liable for tort. Now, if you're not familiar with the term tort, let's jog your memory a bit. Do you still remember the 5 sources of obligation? Sino sa inyo nakakaalala pa ng 5 source of obligation? Kung naaalala pa ninyo, paki-enumerate yung 5. Anybody? Nada? Masyado na bang matagal? Last year pa ang obligo ninyo, di ba? So, law, di ba? Obligations arising from law, obligations arising from contract, obligations arising from quasi-contract, obligations arising from delict, obligations arising from quasi-delict. Quasi-delict, no? Yan yung tort. A quasi-tort is just a synonym for quasi-delict. In the US context, no, where some of the civil codes provisions on torts and damages, on negligence nga, di ba? Doon galing. Ang tawag nila dyan sa quasi-delict ay tort. So an act or omission causing damage to another, di ba? There being fault or negligence where there is no contractual relation between the parties, between the persons involved, no? I think tama naman yung definition ko. Double check nyo na lang. But that's basically tort. So, for example, no, kumakain ka sa isang malaking restaurant. Ano bang restaurant ang operated ng korporasyon maliban sa Jollibee? Sabihin natin, makain ka sa Savory, no? Savory is one of the better chicken restaurants. And while hindi siya per se sosyalin na pagkain, you see, I'm sure you've been in a Savory restaurant before. At a Savory restaurant before. If not, you have to try it. Savory is at that niche, no, category between fast food and fine dining. Fine dining is, well, it is fine dining. Fast food, you know what fast food is. Merong diyang uka sa gitna. Nandoon si Savory. It is not fast food kasi niluluto talaga ng maayos yung pagkain. Hindi kagaya nung nasa fast food restaurant na, frozen lang yan. If you've worked before in fast food, at a fast food resto, no, 'di ba? Ang pagkain kasi diyan, like for example, yung Chicken Joy sa Jollibee. Or saan pa nga ba may Chicken Joy, 'di ba? Basta yung Chicken Joy, no? Frozen, i-deliver, i-deep fry mo lang siya, no? Wala ka nang gagawin. You don't have to marinate anything. As in, you just chuck the frozen chicken doon sa lutuan. There is no, that's about as much cooking that you'll do, no? Hindi mo siya isi-season, wala. You'll just have to make sure na maluluto siya within a certain period of time at a certain temperature, period, no? Wala kang garnishing na gagawin doon, no? Hindi ka magmamalaninong ray doon. As in literal, lalagay mo doon sa lalagyan and then you serve it. That's fast food. Savory, hindi ganun, no? Merong time and effort na dinedevote kada dish. And actually, no, hindi ka pwedeng basta-basta papasok na lang doon. Before COVID, even before COVID, pipila ka. Short of saying na kailangan mo magpa-reserve, no? But hindi siya fine dining kasi affordable yung pagkain doon. Now, sabihin natin kumain ka sa Savory. You were minding your own business, no? You were waiting for your meal. And Savory being Savory, you have to wait for a while. Because, yun nga, hindi siya fast food per se. So you wait, and you wait, and you wait. Now, there is a customer seated behind you, dun sa sarili niyang mesa, na nauna, in all fairness, nauna siya sa'yo doon sa resto. And therefore, it would only make sense to conclude that her order will come before yours. Ito problema. Yung waiter, no? Yung server, food server. Dala-dala yung nando doon sa isang platter, no? Doon sa lalagyan, habang tawag doon, saucer, whatever. Basta alam niyo naman, na-imagine niyo na yan. Nando doon yung iced tea, kasi iced tea yung in-order na drinks, nando doon yung manok. Ito problema. A few minutes prior, merong isang crew na minamap yung sahig. Kasi alam nyo naman, di ba? They have to maintain cleanliness. Minamap yung sahig. Basa, no? Basa. Ang siste, medyo mas basa yung area nung yung part nung sahig na malapit sa iyo, no? Ewan ko na siguro nagstay doon ng medyo mas matagal yung map or something. Eto ngayon, di naglalakad na yung server, no? Sakto papunta sa iyo, nadulas siya. Natapon yung dala niya sa iyo, no? Yung manok, yung kanin, tumapon sa damit mo. Ang problema, yung damit mo puti. Yung baso ng iced tea, no? Syempre nabuhos din sa iyo. Ang masakit pa nun, no? Medyo masakit yung pagtama ng baso sa mukha mo, no? So hindi ka lang nabasa, nasaktan ka pa. Ngayon, no? Sino ang sasampahan mo ng kaso? Is it the food server? No, because the new civil code provides for what we call vicarious liability, no? In enforcing obligations arising from quasi-delict, if the person who committed the act or omission concerned answers to a boss or to a supervisor, yung boss o yung supervisor yung iyong kakasuhan. And in this case, since Savory is a corporation, you file a case against the corporation. Because as established in our jurisprudence, in this case, no, as early as 1978 in the case of PNB versus CA 83 SCRA 237, a corporation can be held liable for tort or for obligations arising from quasi-delict. Particularly when the act was committed by the officer or agent under express direction or authority from the stockholders or members. So being that the server reports to a manager and the manager reports to the corporation itself, you can hold Savory liable for any mishap. You suffered moral damages, na-stress ka ng sobra. Puti yung damit mo, sabihin natin may aatinan ka pa nga, ano ba to? Ano ba ang uso ngayong bago mag-election? Yung mga meeting de avance. No? Actually, tatanungin ko nga dapat kayo kung a-attend ba kayo ng ganyan over the weekend. But anyway, no, we have a lot of catching up to do. You can hold the corporation liable. That is part and parcel of their having a separate and distinct personality. Now what else, no? Also by virtue of this separate personality, a corporation has a nationality, just like a natural person. Kaya meron tayong tinatawag na Filipino corporations, meron tayong tinatawag na foreign corporations, kasi may nationality sila. Now, what is the primary test in determining what the nationality of a given corporation is? We use the place of incorporation test. Kaya mapapansin ninyo, no? Kung nag-OJT kayo o nag-internship kayo sa isang corporation, di ba? Mapapansin niyo sa kanilang sa blurb nila, kumbaga, doon sa vision, mission statement nila o doon sa about us nila, di ba? A corporation incorporated under the laws of the Philippines, for example, no? That is in pursuance to the place of incorporation test provided under Section 140 of the Revised Corporation Code. Ano ang sabi ni Section 140? The corporation is a national of the country under whose laws it is organized or incorporated. Kaya ganun. Nasa about us yan ng anumang korporasyon. You go to their website or if you're interning o doon ka magtatrabaho balang araw, no? Tingnan mo sa about us nila o doon sa kanilang employee handbook. organized or incorporated under the laws of the Philippines. Pag nakita mo yun, it's a Filipino corporation. This corporation has Filipino nationality. However, minsan hindi yan ganun kadali. No? Hence, the need for an ancillary test. This ancillary test that we can use is what the Supreme Court calls the control test. Particularly applicable when we are talking about corporations engaged in business or owning properties or with regard to industries reserved for Filipinos only. Mamaya, we will be discussing what these businesses are. I'm sure narinig nyo na to. No? Like for example, I can give you right off the bat 2 examples. Again, this is not a political statement of any kind, just for purposes of discussion. You guys know Rappler, right? Rappler, the news entity, no? Operating a website, has a YouTube channel where news updates are being shown and reported, operates a Twitter and Instagram, na ganun din, no? They report news. At some point in the past, nagkaroon ng issue yan with regard to what we call corporate layering. No? Kasi apparently, ang sinasabi ng mga kumu-question, no, sa nationality ni Rappler is that a majority, allegedly, we don't know, no? Allegedly, a majority of the stocks of Rappler is owned by a foreign entity. A foreign entity called Omidyar. Now ako personally, I have nothing against Rappler. I read their articles. I like how they report. In particular, how Maria Ressa reports. She's a very intelligent woman. The prize she won was well deserved. No, I believe that is something that any person, regardless of whatever political leaning they lean towards, I would think that's something everybody should respect. But anyway, no, yun yung issue nila. Yun yung issue nung Rappler as a corporation. There is an allegation that it is a majority of its assets, of its stocks, no, is owned by a foreign entity. Now, why is this an issue? Because of this. Because in certain industries, kailangan at least 60% of the stocks owned by Filipinos. Hindi pa pwedeng majority owned ng foreigners. What are these industries? Under the Constitution, no? Under Article 12 of the 1987 Constitution on National Economy and Patrimony, you can check your copy of your Constitution if you have one, no? Section 2 provides, no, that any corporation, not verbatim, you can check naman. Any corporation engaged in the business of the utilization of natural resources. So anong covered nito? Mining, logging, energy generation, no? Geothermal, wind energy, solar, biomass, no? Lahat ng may kinalaman sa paglinang ng likas yaman ng bansa, dapat at least 60% ng capital stock niyan dapat pagmamay-ari ng Pilipino. Now, readily understandable kung bakit, 'di ba? Kasi likas yaman natin yan. Bakit natin nahayaan na mga foreign-owned companies ang makinabang? It should be, more than anybody, the Filipinos who should benefit from our own natural resources. Is that right? Diba? I believe we can all agree to that. Section 11 naman gives Congress the power, the authority to identify whatever industries or businesses should be at least 60% Filipino-owned. No? Mamaya, after this slide, makikita nyo what some of those industries are. So, merong discretion ang ating Kongreso, namely ang ating Senate and House of Representatives, to determine what should be included in our list, no, of nationalized industries na tinatawag. And finally, Section 12, which singles out what we call public utilities. What are public utilities? Transportation. Power generation din, actually, no? What is the power generator sa ano? I believe most, if not all of you, are based in Sariaya or elsewhere in Quezon. Is that correct? Meron ba ditong nakatira outside of Quezon?
Wala po, sir.
Lahat kayo Sariaya, no? Sino ang power producer or power provider sa Sariaya? Anong cooperative? Kung familiar kayo. Kasi Meralco is only NCR and some parts of Luzon, like Region 4A. Ano to, Meralco pa to dito sa Cavite. Pero I think iba na yata ang power provider sa Quezon. Is that correct? O mali ang recollection ko?
Sir, Meralco pa rin po.
Ah, Meralco pa din. Oh, that's okay. Sige. So that's ano. So ibig sabihin, if I make a reference to Meralco, at least on all fours tayong lahat dito. Good. Meralco is such corporation. No? Meralco is engaged in a nationalized industry because the generation of power not only utilizes natural resources under Section 2 of Article 12, it also is classified as a public utility. A public utility is basically a utility, a business, or a service, the purpose of which is for the benefit of the public. If you're a power producer, yung pinoproduce mong power is para sa kapakinabangan, no, nung mga customer mo, no, within your power grid. So, Meralco tayo, no? Public utility yan. Therefore, hindi pwedeng mangyari na si Meralco, yung majority ng kanyang capital stock ay ma-acquire ng foreigners. Hindi pwede. Meralco should be Filipino-owned. Or at least 60% na kanyang assets dapat Filipino-owned. No? Lahat ng power producer, kung tutusin nyo, whether whether Napocor or Meralco or yung mga power producers, whether corporation yan or cooperative yan, all over the country, lahat yan Filipino-owned. Because power production, power generation, power distribution, lahat yan public utilities. Transportation din. Mapapansin niyo yung mga bus companies dito sa Pilipinas, yung korporasyon na in charge sa UV Express, yung nagme-maintain ng mga bus ports, ng mga bus terminals, no? Mga barkot, mga bangka, mga eroplano, no? Filipino-owned. Or at least 60% ng assets niya Filipino-owned. Of course, Philippine Airlines, Cebu Pacific, AirAsia Philippines is at least 60% Filipino-owned. Okay? Super Ferry, yung mga may-ari ng mga Roro, no? Ano ba mga bus companies na yon? Tastrans, St. Anthony. Hindi ko na alam kung anong mga bus yung bumabiyahe elsewhere. Yun lang yung familiar ako. So you're gonna have to bear with me on that. Basta malinaw sa inyo na yan public transpo, public utility yan. So lahat yan dapat Filipino-owned. Or at least majority Filipino-owned. What else is a public utility? Media. Kaya in hot water si Rappler. Allegedly. Though of course not proven. Yung connection with Omidyar, not yet proven in court yan. It has to go through the process of the justice system. Pero that's the allegation. No? Na if proven true, hindi yun pwede. It contravenes the very constitution itself. Because if a corporation is engaged in a public utility, like media, no, it must be at least 60% Filipino-owned. Now, dito tayo pupunta dun sa second one, dun sa section 11, no? Congress is given sufficient leeway to determine which industries should be part of the nationalized or Filipinized industries. Kaya nag-enact ang ating Kongreso ng Republic Act number 7042 or the Foreign Investments Act, which liberalized the entry of foreign investments. So, merong mga industries na okay lang na 100% foreign owned or majority foreign owned. But there is a pronounced list, yung tinatawag nating negative list na nakailang iteration na. As of October 2012, the negative list is already at its 9th iteration. Now, this 9th negative list covers certain businesses, reiterating mass media, no? Retail trade. If you're a business engaged in retail, no, kailangan majority owned ka ng Filipinos. Private securities agencies, cockpits, mga sabungan. Well, I would think wala namang foreign owned or operated na sabungan dito sa Pilipinas. Sabong is a very Filipino hobby. Though I can't say the same about isabong, no? And isabong is already prohibited. May nag-iisabong ba dito? Ay, recorded pala tong lecture na to. No, never mind. Manufacture of pyrotechnics, no? Now this one, manufacture of pyrotechnics, firecrackers, mga paputok, this is included in the negative list, I think, in order to protect the burgeoning pyrotechnics industry in Bulacan and other places. Kasi sino ba ang kanilang mga kakompetensya sa pagbebenta ng mga paputok? Kapag pupunta kayo sa mall, sabihin natin, ano ba to? Kailan lang ba nagpapa-fireworks, no? Pag pistang bayan, pag magbabagong taon, no? So either pista o bagong taon, punta kayo sa mall. Pag shopping rush na, yari, almost the new year na. So nandiyan na yung mga pwesto na nagbebenta ng paputok. Dalawa lang naman ang source ng mga paputok if you look closely. Either the locally made ones from Bulacan, from Nueva Ecija or elsewhere, or China. And you know how aggressively competitive China is when it comes to business in general, in production. No? They have so much manpower, they have so much resources. Now, the moment that the manufacture of pyrotechnics is, deleted from the negative list, I can guarantee you, patay yung mga industriya, yung mga korporasyon na nagmamanufacture ng fireworks sa Bulacan. They are all dead. Because they simply would not be able to compete against China. They simply cannot. Okay? Kaya pinoprotektahan sila. Ang pwede lang magbenta ng paputok dito sa Pilipinas ay Filipino corporations. And what is a Filipino corporation in this context? One that is at least 60% owned by Filipinos. And yun nga, finally, the practice of professions. Mapapansin niyo yan. If you intend to apply at an accounting firm after you graduate, papansinin nyo, lahat yan Filipino-owned. Diba? Of course, the veritable SGV. No? Ngayon, merong mga subsidiaries na tinatawag na mga foreign accounting firms. Pero hindi ibig sabihin nun, anong tawag dito? Hindi ibig sabihin nun 100%. Let me just admit, sorry. Hindi ibig sabihin nun hindi na 100% Filipino-owned yung subsidiary. Like for example, ano ba to? Yung PwC. PwC has a Filipino subsidiary. Yung PricewaterhouseCoopers, no? One of the bigger accounting firms worldwide, no? Ang kanilang Filipino subsidiary ay si Isla Lipana. I would think you've heard of both. I hope, no? Isla Lipana and Company. Isla Lipana has its principal office in Makati, near my office at OSG. Isla Lipana is 100% Filipino. Nagkataon lang na by way of agreement, no, they became affiliated with PricewaterhouseCoopers. But, it still falls within the provision of 7042. Because, ano bang sabi ni 7042? Part of the nationalized industries, yung practice of professions. Kaya Isla Lipana, 100% Filipino-owned din siya. Wala kayong makikita na nag-ooperate dito na law firm na foreign. Bawal. Because the practice of law, like any other profession, is a nationalized industry. Sino ba to? Sino ba tong doktor na YouTuber na nag-Filipino? Yung medyo sikat, foreigner. I don't remember the name but I suppose some of you or at least one of you know, no? Sinong doktor to? Si Doc something, medyo malaki katawan na medyo balbasarado, na hirap managalog pero nananagalog. Yung meron siyang mga, nagbibigay-bigay siya ng mga medical opinions niya. Ano nga pangalan nito? Kilala nyo ba yon? Or at least, kung hindi nyo naalala din yung pangalan, like I do, I don't remember the name.
Sir, ako parang kilala ko po yun.
Sino yan?
Pero
Sino yan?
Pero ko rin nga maalala yung pangalan, pero hirap nga po siya managal.
Oh, kilala, parang, basta naiisip mo kung sino yung dinidescribe ko, that's well and good.
Apo.
Hindi siya engaged in the practice of medicine dito sa Pilipinas. Hindi rin siya pwedeng maging miyembro ng isang hindi rin siya pwedeng magtayo, no, ng medical practice dito or ng any corporation relating to medical practice kasi bawal. Okay? Kaya hanggang YouTube lang yung kanyang dito, yung kanyang ginagawa dito sa Pilipinas. Kung gusto niya mag-practice ng medicine, he has to go back to, I think, hindi ako sure kung Australian siya, basta dun sa home country niya. So technically, here in the Philippines, he is a content creator, not necessarily in the practice of medicine. Okay? Kaya ganun. So, yan. That's with regard to nationality. Now, no, the control test has certain subsets. Kasi it's one thing, no? It's one thing to just take a look at the capital stock of a corporation. Kasi of course you can reduce it to numerical values, no? Madali mong makikita kung 60 kung sa tawag dito kung compliant siya sa 60/40, no? Uupo ka lang, kung kailangan mo ng calculator, maglabas ka ng calculator. Actually, pwede mong papel lang mental math mo lang. Sulat mo sa papel. You can easily determine whether a given corporation satisfies the control test. Now, the main subset, yung sinasabi kong the easy part, no? That is provided under the case of Gamboa versus Teves, no? The two issuances of the court, one in 2011, the main decision, and another in 2012, which is the resolution regarding yung motion for reconsideration na final ng parties. Reiterated in Roy III versus Herbosa in 2016 and 2017, as well as in a memorandum circular of the SEC, that would be Memorandum Circular number 8, no, series of 2013. Ano ang sabi dito sa Gamboa versus Teves? Now, all covered corporations, basically yung mga corporations falling within the nationalized industries, whether in the Constitution or under the Foreign Investments Act, shall at all times observe the constitutional or statutory ownership requirement. In that, the required percentage of Filipino ownership shall be applied to both the total number of voting shares as well as the total number of non-voting shares. Now, this early, no, in our discussion, we have to distinguish between voting and non-voting shares. Balang araw, kapag kayo ay, young urban professionals na, you're already working, maalala ninyo yung sinabi ni Attorney Sebria na baka good idea na bumili ako ng stocks. Kasi, no, aside from your active income, you also have to, it would be better if you also have passive income. Passive income being, it grows kahit na wala kang ginagawa. Diba? So maliban dun sa meron kang day job, meron kang sweldo na nakukuha mo sa 8 to 5 mo, meron ka ding passive income na kumikita simply by your mere investment in money. Ngayon, hindi naman ito multi-level marketing. Umiwas kayo doon. Utang na loob. Pero yung stocks, no, that is a much better way by which to earn your passive income. Ngayon, sabihin natin kagaya ng sinabi ko kanina, 'di ba? Bibili ka ng shares of stock doon sa mga corporations, publicly traded corporations na hindi ka naman gigising ng isang umaga na nalugi ka na bumaba bigla yung value ng mga stocks. Hindi na siya worth it ibenta. Kasi you can buy, you can sell shares of stock, no? Bibili ka doon sa medyo stable. no? Like in most kings. Doon tayo sa stable. Now, no, hindi porke bumili ka ng stock sa isang kumpanya, ibig sabihin nun, kagaya nga nung example ko kanina, hindi ibig sabihin bumili ka ng shares of stock sa Jollibee, pwede ka nang manghingi ng libreng pagkain doon. Kasi, 'di ba? One of the perhaps half joking na arguments is that once you buy a share of stock, no, in a particular company, you technically become part owner of it. That's partially true. No? Shares of stock, no, that's proof of you being part of this particular corporation. You are now a shareholder. That is true. That much is true. But no, the mere possession of a stock alone, especially if the shares of stock that you acquired is non-voting in nature, that only entitles you to passive income. Pag may kinita yung korporasyon, you might be entitled to something. Yung dividends na tinatawag natin. But, the fact alone that you were able to buy a particular share of stock, that does not entitle you to cast your lot in a vote. No? For example, magpapalit ng board of directors si Jollibee Foods Corporation. Hindi porke nakabili ka ng isa o dalawang shares of stock, pwede ka nang pumunta doon sa head office ng Jollibee at sasabihin mo, boboto ako, no? Sa plebisito. Hindi ganun yun. Because only persons, only shareholders with voting shares are entitled to that. So merong distinction. Hindi lahat ng shares of stock pareho. No, meron tayong voting, meron tayong non-voting. Now, ang sabi sa Gamboa versus Teves is that we should not distinguish for purposes of determining whether a corporation is Filipino or not. No? For example, if a mining corporation is Filipino or if it is foreign, we have to count all the shares. We have to count doon sa voting shares as well as doon sa non-voting shares. Kailangan holistic. Yan yung sinasabi ni Gamboa versus Teves. You have to count everything. You do not exclude non-voting shares simply because of the argument na wala naman silang influence doon sa policy direction or corporate decisions ng company. No, that's not how it works. You have to include them in the counting. Kasi baka mamaya, majority Filipino doon sa voting shares. Pero paano kung overwhelmingly foreign pala siya doon sa non-voting shares? Di ipit pa rin yun doon sa control test. Hindi natin pwedeng sabihin na, Filipino corporation, no. Therefore, you have to count everything. Because every share, like every vote, counts. Okay. Now, the other subset, so that's the Gamboa versus Teves test. Yan yung general rule. Okay? Kung madaling i-quantify, no, regardless of the nature of the shares involved, kung madaling i-quantify yung participation nung foreign aspect doon sa company. May kita mo 30% foreign owned by this particular corporate sub-corporation ganyan. This particular corporation, sabihin natin, Corporation X is a Swedish corporation. Corporation X owns 30% of the stock of Corporation Y, a Filipino corporation. So Filipino shareholders yung may-ari ng 70%. Kung ganon yung facts, ang linaw-linaw, we apply the Gamboa test. 70% Filipino-owned, 30% foreign-owned. Ano ang nationality ng corporation? Di Filipino. Okay? Now, itong grandfather rule na to applies when things are a bit more complicated. Dito papasok yung kwento ko kanina about Rappler. Allegedly, di umano, merong corporate layering na nagaganap. Why? Ang sabi kasi nila, now Rappler, its assets, no, its capital stock, no, owned by different corporations din or groups, no? Or individuals. Ang sabi nila, while on its face, no, yung sa mismong corporate documents ni Rappler mismo, daw, ha? For purposes of discussion lang to, I'm just clarifying. Omidyar owns only a measly minimal portion of the assets of Rappler. Which kung ganun lang, kung doon lang yun matatapos, di okay, we apply Gamboa. Diba? We apply Gamboa, simple mathematical computation, o sabihin natin, for purposes of this lecture lang, sabihin natin 15% owned by Omidyar. O that's ibig sabihin 85% Filipino. Di pasok, di ba? End of story. Kaso, ang allegation is that Omidyar also owns assets. No? Also owns shares doon sa mga ibang Filipino corporations na meron ding pagmamay-aring shares of stock kay Rappler. So basically, dyan papasok yung tinatawag nating corporate layering. In order to mask foreign ownership in an otherwise allegedly Filipino corporation, ginagawang dami, in a sense, yung ibang Filipino corporations. Now, ano ang sabi ng Supreme Court dito sa case ng Nara versus Redmond, a 2014 case? No? GR number 195580. Although the control test is the prevailing mode of determining whether a corporation is a Filipino corporation, entitled under Section 2, Article 2 of the 1987 Constitution, Article 12 nga yata dapat yan, to undertake the exploration, development, and utilization of the natural resources of the Philippines when there is doubt in the minds of the courts based on the attendant facts and circumstances of the case in the 60-40 Filipino foreign equity of the corporation, they may apply the grandfather rule. Now, noong nilabas ng Supreme Court, in this case of Nara, yung grandfather rule, ang unang-unang tanong ng mga abogado at ng mga corporate law experts, so ano na ang mangyayari sa Gamboa test ngayon? Is the control test now superseded or replaced by the grandfather rule? Ang sabi ng Supreme Court in its 2015 resolution, the grandfather test does not eschew, but in fact supplements the control test. And I agree. Ang grandfather rule, this is the exception. Kapag merong pagdududa base doon sa facts of the case na hindi natin pwedeng i-apply straightforward yung Gamboa test, Gamboa control test, then we apply the grandfather rule. No? This is the method by which the percentage of Filipino equity in a corporation engaged in nationalized and or partly nationalized areas of activities provided for under the Constitution and other nationalization laws is computed in cases where corporate shareholders are present by attributing the nationality of the second or even subsequent tier of ownership to determine the nationality of the corporate shareholder. Yan ang sabi ng Supreme Court. Now, there's this looming question then. What led the Supreme Court to apply this grandfather rule in Nara? Ganito kasi ang nangyari, class, sa Nara. Kaya hindi ko na ipapadigest to sa inyo. I'm outlining the facts already. Because, no, not only dahil lalabas to, or rather baka lalabas to sa exam, no? Forget what I said. Magagamit nyo to in the future. Kasi as yung sa course ninyo, no, you might encounter a question later on in your professional life where you will be asked by your superior or superiors, are we dealing with a Filipino corporation? And you have to take a look at the facts. You have to take a look at the numbers. You have to take a look at the different shareholders in this given corporation. Can we apply Gamboa? Are the facts straightforward and clear? If they are, then we apply Gamboa versus Teves. You apply the control test. But if the facts seem to be complicated, if the so-called Filipino corporate shareholders, yung mga Filipino corporations na shareholder nitong korporasyon na pinapaaral sa'yo, majority foreign-owned, then you might have to stop and think, baka hindi si Gamboa ang kailangan nating i-apply dito. It might be that it is better to apply the grandfather rule. Now, What happened in this case? There are three corporations, all mining corporations. So we have MacArthur Mining Incorporated, MacArthur for short, Tesoro and Mining and Development Incorporated, or Tesoro, and Nara Nickel Mining and Development Corporation, or NARA. No? Hence, NARA. Siya yung primary petitioner dun sa Supreme Court case. MacArthur, Tesoro, and NARA all applied separately for the issuance of what we call an MPSA, a Mineral Production Sharing Agreement. They applied for that agreement with the DNR. Basically, the MPSA will allow them to conduct mining activities in a particular jurisdiction or in a particular place. So sabihin natin, merong paanan ng bundok na to in this particular forest, no, outside Metro Manila, na ayon sa mga pag-aaral maraming nickel deposit, no? Nag-apply itong tatlong kumpanya na to in order for them to be able to mine doon sa lugar. Ang kalaban nila, no? So of course kasi syempre if it's kumbaga sa lote ng sa real estate, kumbaga prime lot to, okay? At dahil doon, itong si MacArthur, itong si Tesoro at itong si Nara, meron din silang mga rival applicants. One of those rival applicants is Redmond Consolidated Mines Incorporated. So si Redmond, sinampahan niya ng mga petitions, no? Itong tatlo. So Redmond filed petitions, 3 petitions. One against MacArthur, another against Tesoro, and another one against Nara, for their applications for MPSAs to be denied. Kasi ang sabi ni Redmond, yang si MacArthur, yang si Tesoro at yang si Nara, hindi sila qualified persons. Remember that mining activities are nationalized industries, nationalized activities. Okay? Because ano ang basis or rather basis kasi madami? Section 2 of Article 12, di ba? The utilization of natural resources should be only for Filipino corporations and Filipino citizens. Kasama din ang mining doon sa Foreign Investments Act. So patong-patong na nagsasabi na authority na mining activities are reserved only for Filipino citizens. And ergo, ang MPSA pwede mo lang i-issue sa Filipino. So ang sinasabi ni Redmond, MacArthur is not a Filipino corporation. Tesoro is also not a Filipino corporation, and so is Nara. Okay? With me so far? Now ito, no? If you want, no, you can take out a pen and paper right now. I want you to try doing the math for this. MacArthur is composed of Madridejos Mining Corporation, a Filipino corporation. Okay? Want you to take note of this. MacArthur has a total of 10,000 shares. 10,000 shares. Okay? Si Madridejos, which is allegedly a Filipino corporation, owns 5,997 out of 10,000 shares. So that would be 59.9%, right? At least I would think so, no? 60% pag ni-round up mo, 60%. And MBMI Resources Incorporated, which is a Canadian corporation, which owns 3,998 out of the 10,000 shares of MacArthur. So 39.9. Round up mo 40. So on its face, if we apply Gamboa, is MacArthur a Filipino corporation? If we apply Gamboa, class, can anybody venture a guess? Wag natin i-apply yung grandfather rule, no? Mamaya pa lang natin i-apply. Kung dito natin tatapusin, is MacArthur applying the control test in Gamboa? Filipino or foreign? Going. Yan. Filipino. If we apply Gamboa. Kasi saktong-sakto, oh. Parang too good to be true, no? Saktong-sakto 60%. 60% Filipino, 40% foreign. Parang napaka-precision naman, no? But technically, if we apply Gamboa, then MacArthur is a Filipino corporation. However, this is where the problem lies. Madridejos, no, also has 10,000 shares of stock. Kaya grandfather rule, no? We are going upwards, no? So titignan din natin yung nationality ng corporation. Okay? Which owns a percentage of the shares of stock nitong mismong korporasyon whose nationality we are determining. So ngayon, no, Madridejos Mining Corporation, which owns 59.9%, 60% of the shares of MacArthur. Madridejos also has 10,000 shares of stock. Now, MBMI, si Canadian Corporation, owns 3,331 shares of the 10,000 shares of Madridejos Mining Corporation. So, ibig sabihin, hindi 100% Filipino si Madridejos. It is 30% owned. 30% owned by a foreign entity. Diyan papasok si grandfather rule. Ibig sabihin, if we do the math, let me just take out my calculator for a bit. Yan. MBMI owns 60%, no, of the 10,000 shares of MacArthur. Now, if MBMI owns 33%, no, of the 10,000 shares of Madridejos itself, ibig sabihin nun, let me just do a quick, hindi ko kaya i-mental math to, admittedly. Okay. Yon. Okay. So, ibig sabihin, no, in actuality, MBMI actually owns 60% applying the grandfather rule. Ha? Kasi kung titingnan ninyong mabuti, no, MBMI owns 33%, i-round down natin. So 30% of the 10,000 shares of Madridejos. Which means that, no, Madridejos is 30% foreign owned. 70% Filipino owned lang siya. So that would be, no, 70% of 60. The supposed 60% doon sa 60% ng supposed Filipino ownership if we apply Gamboa. So that would be 70% of 60, which is merely 42. Yun lang yung Filipino ownership talaga if we apply the grandfather rule. I-round down natin si 42. 40. Which would mean, by necessary implication, that foreign ownership with regard to MacArthur is a whopping 60%. Baliktad pala if we apply the grandfather rule. Again, bakit siya grandfather rule? Kasi bubusisiin mo din yung foreign ownership ng mga corporations, no, comprising the ownership of the shares of stocks nung mismong grandson or granddaughter corporation. Now, punta tayo kay Tesoro. Tesoro and Mining and Development Incorporated is composed by Sara Marie Mining, no? Owning, ganun din, no? Kaya mapapansin niyo, mukhang may tamang hinala si Redmond dito. Kasi yung percentages are almost too good. Well, too good to be true talaga. 60% din, no? Tapos si MDMI also owns 3,998 shares of stock out of the 10,000 shares kay Tesoro. Eh kaso mo, no? Si MBMI din ay may-ari ng 3,331 shares out of 10,000 ni Sara Marie Mining. May pinag-iba ba kay MacArthur? Wala. So we apply the same mathematical computation, no? In actuality, if we apply the grandfather rule, in truth, no, if we take into consideration the foreign ownership here in Sara Marie, no, makikita natin, actually 60% foreign owned si Tesoro. The same way as it is with MacArthur. Ngayon, tignan natin dito kay Nara. No? Ganon din. Magkaiba lang yung number ng shares na pagmamay-ari ni MBMI kay Patricia Luis Mining and Development Corporation. Pero actually, no, almost the same. Tingnan ninyong mabuti, di ba? Yung ganitong level of repetition is very suspicious. Also considering that these three mining corporations mayroong common foreign owner. Si MBMI, which is a Canadian corporation. And evidently, if we just apply Gamboa, then the Canadian company would have gotten away, no? Would have gotten away with this, scot-free. Kasi kung titingnan mo lang sa papel, no? Yung corporate ownership nung mismong stockholders ng corporation mismo, for example, itong si Nara o itong si Tesoro o itong si MacArthur, no? Kung doon mo lang ititigil, oo, 60-40, 60-40. Pero yun pala, may corporate layering na nagaganap. Na actually, yung so-called Filipino corporation ay foreign-owned din in part. And therefore, it is only right, it is only just that we count, no? That we check the amount of foreign ownership doon sa supposed Filipino corporation. Aakyat ka sa grandfather, hence the name, the grandfather rule. And you take that into account, no? When we compute the actual amount or the actual level of foreign ownership that we are dealing with here. I will be giving be giving an infographic, ipopost ko sa LMS para mas malinaw, para mas kaya ninyo mag-compute, no? Better kung mayroong diagram na kasama to. So it would be much clearer to you. Now, ano ang sabi ng Supreme Court? Analyzing the foreign ownership levels nitong tatlong corporation applicants. No? Diba? Just like what I said earlier. Look. Petitioners MacArthur, Tesoro, and Nara are not Filipino. Since MBMI, a 100% Canadian corporation, owns 60% or more of their equities interests. Such conclusion is derived from grandfathering petitioners' corporate owners. Noticeably, the ownership of the layered corporations boils down to the group wherein MBMI has joint venture agreements with, practically exercising majority control over the corporation's venture. Now, in effect, sabi ng Supreme Court, whether looking at the capital structure or the underlying relationship between and among the corporations, petitioners are not Filipino nationals and must be considered foreign, since 60% or more of their capital stocks or equity interests are owned by MBMI. So that's with regard to nationality. Let us move forward to what we call the veil of corporate fiction. Rekta tayo sa aspect ng corporation being an artificial being. Kaya ng sinabi natin kanina, di ba? Sure, a corporation is a person. It is a juridical person with its separate juridical personality. Different, distinct from those of its stockholders, of its directors, of its officers and agents. However, it is merely an artificial being, a creation of the law. And therefore, it can only act through its directors, officers, and employees. Hence the term veil of corporate fiction. Saan ang galing tong term na to? Familiar ba kayo sa stereotype, no? If you're the kind who watches period dramas na tinatawag, yung mga Korean and or Chinese period dramas, or even the Japanese one, mga J-drama ba, na you know the stereotype of the emperor or the empress, no? Hindi yan nakikipag-usap sa kanyang court, 'di ba? Yan ang tawag doon sa kanyang mga opisyales. Kumbaga sa modernong politika, yung tinatawag nating gabinete. Those officers back in the day, back in Imperial Japan, China and Korea, yan tinatawag na court, no? The emperor or empress does not talk to the court or does not talk to a visitor or a messenger face to face. They talk to the court, to any messenger, and actually to the general public. They address their subjects from behind a veil. What is the reason for that? Diba? Because rulers at the time, ito yung period ng history na naniniwala ang mga subjects ng isang imperyo doon sa concept ng the divine right of rulers. Na ang mga emperador at ang mga emperatrice ay kung hindi mismong Diyos, mga anak o mga descendant ng Diyos. And therefore, malaking kasalanan yung makita mo sila ng mukha sa mukha. Therefore, they will only talk to you, or rather, you, an ordinary human, no, can only talk to them nang nandoon sila sa likod ng veil. Okay? Hence, the veil of corporate fiction. The corporation, parang hari, parang emperador. Hindi niya kayang makipag-interact sa physical na mundo by itself. And therefore, it can only do so through the physical, natural persons. Yung mga directors niya, board of directors, officers niya, kung meron siyang chairman, kung meron siyang corporate secretary, meron siyang corporate treasurer, and of course, the ordinary employees. At yung korporasyon mismo, parang nag-uutos lang mula sa likod ng isang veil, no? Na parang hari. Kausapin mo to. Makipagkontrata ka kay ganito. Mag-appear ka dito sa korte kasi may kaso tayo. Ganon. Hence the veil of corporate fiction. Now, being an artificial being, a corporation is of course incapable of intent. And therefore, it cannot commit felonies, crimes punishable under the revised penal code. Ang korporasyon ay walang katawan at dahil doon, hindi niya kayang pumatay. Hindi niya kayang magnakaw. Hindi niya kayang mambugbog. Hindi niya kayang manamantala. As well as crimes punishable under special laws. Hindi mo pwedeng kasuhan ng isang korporasyon ng illegal possession of drugs, ng illegal possession of firearms and explosives dahil hindi yan natural person. These crimes, no, whether punishable under the RPC or punishable under what we call special penal laws, they are personal in nature. You have to pin that crime to a natural person. Dahil ang natural person ang nambubugbog, dahil natural person ang pumapatay, natural person ang nagnanakaw, natural person ang nananamantala. Of course, no? A corporation having no physical body, it cannot be imprisoned. But it can be dissolved, no? Like a partnership. The same implications then as a partnership. When a corporation is dissolved, it undergoes final accounting. Its assets are being winded up. Corporation debts are being settled. If an administrator has to be appointed in order to, to facilitate the process, then one will be appointed. And once everything is said and done, then the corporate life of the corporation is terminated. Parang ganun lang din. We are just miming yung sa partnership. But of course, yun nga, if a corporation is found to have violated some provision of the revised corporation code, it can be dissolved. Now, of course, as a general rule, well, this of course should go without saying, a corporation is incapable of feeling. It is an artificial being. It cannot feel. And therefore, it cannot be awarded moral damages. I would think you were acquainted with the idea of moral damages when you were taught oblicon, or at least sa Law 102 ninyo. Now, if not, moral damages are awarded when a person injured by a quasi-delict sustains stress, no? Sleepless nights, psychological, mental injury, emotional injury, no? Like for example, no, kasal mo, no, araw ng kasal mo, prepared na lahat. Hindi ka sinipot nung bride mo, ng groom mo. O di kaya, no, pakasal kayo, natapos yung seremonya, nalaman nyo, tinakbuhan pala kayo nung tao na inappoint ninyo magiging punong abala para sa reception. So ang nangyari, this is a true story by the way, ha? True story sa Cebu. I think around 2 years ago. Nag-trending to, no? Kasal, okay? Natapos ang kasal, nalaman nila na tinakbo nung kanilang punong abala yung lahat ng pera. So walang na-book na place para sa reception, walang na-book na caterer, wala lahat. Walang band, walang anything. Wala. So pagkatapos ng kasal, wala silang nagawa kundi umiyak na lang. They can sue that person not only for what is the usual crime for that? Estafa, usual charge, no? Estafa kasi tinakbo yung pera with abuse of confidence. Pero on top of that, pwede rin siyang magsampa ng kaso for moral damages. Kasi syempre, naiyak ka na, napahiya ka na at lahat. Yung mental health mo, nagkanda loko-loko na. Nakita ng lahat na humahagulgol ka sa labas ng simbahan, sa tabi ng kalsada, nakatrahe de boda ka pa, nakaupo ka lang dun sa tabi. Tapos, yun nga, syempre, dahil mabilis mag-viral ng mga bagay dito sa atin, no? In this day and age, so nakita ng lahat ng tao kung ano yung nangyayari sa'yo, kung ano yung problema mo. So talagang, ngayon, alam mo, gumuho yung mundo sa harapan mo. So that's what justifies moral damages. Now, a corporation cannot feel all that. A corporation cannot feel pain. It cannot feel disappointment. It cannot feel anger. And therefore, it cannot be awarded moral damages. Moral damages, again, are based on emotion. No? I will be asking you to read this case. This is an interesting case. Both the majority decision and the dissenting opinion. Napocor versus Philip Brothers Oceanic Incorporated. Now, by way of exception, a corporation can recover moral damages in this particular instance only. The basis is what? Article 2219, Item 7 of the New Civil Code. And only in cases of defamation. Because while a corporation is incapable of feeling, it is incapable of feeling shame, may epekto ang defamation. Kasi, di ba, like in any business endeavor, whether a corporation lives or dies, whether a corporation survives or falls under, is dependent on the pristine nature, untarnished nature of its reputation. How many businesses can you remember na nasira at nalugi dahil sa hindi magandang reputasyon? May mga restaurant na nagsasara ng tuluyan kasi nalaman at mayroong nag-post sa social media na mayroong nakitang insekto sa pagkain nila. Dahil doon, nag-imbestiga ang city or municipal health office. Nakita na hindi compliant sa health regulations yung restaurant. Pinasara. O di kaya, di ba? Sinasabi na, nako, maraming magnanakaw dyan sa mall na yan. O sa establishment na to, nako, pangit yung mga binibentang mga gamit dyan. Di ba? It has a substantial effect on the business operations of a corporation. Masasaktan, no? Masasaktan. Hindi lang yung mga board of directors, but anybody, no, who owns a share of stock, who is otherwise entitled to dividends. Kasi dama nilang lahat yan kapag hindi kumita yung korporasyon. Another example, no? Sabihin natin si ABS-CBN, no? Ngayon, just a segue lang, one of the interesting parts of this election would be if ABS-CBN would be able to regain its lost frequency, or at least its franchise to operate once a new president is in place, no? We have yet to see, but hopefully, no? Kasi maraming nagre-rely sa ABS for quality programming, for the delivery of news, more importantly, especially those in far off areas. But that's all up in the air pa at the moment. We might say na isang malaking depende yan. Whether you believe that ABS has not paid taxes as some sectors are alleging, despite BIR saying na bayad naman sila. But that's a big if. Now, sabihin natin theoretically, hindi nagsara si ABS pero persistent yung mga allegations na hindi yan nagbabayad ng buwis, hindi yan nagbabayad ng buwis. So much so that ABS suffered a dip in its reputation. It can sue, no? It can sue those news peddlers for defamation. Praying for what? Moral damages. Because while a corporation cannot feel, it can still stand to suffer the adverse effects of defamatory statements. Oo nga, wala nga siyang mararamdaman. Hindi siya masasaktan dahil ang artificial being ay hindi nasasaktan. Pero yung business operations naman niya, yung maaaring maapektuhan. Which would justify, sabi ng Supreme Court in the case of Filipinas Broadcasting Network Incorporated versus Ago Medical and Educational Center, GR number 1419948, January 2005 decision. Sabi ng Supreme Court, pwedeng mag-file ng action for moral damages on the ground of defamation. Now, we talked about the veil of corporate fiction. A corporation, again, cannot act by itself, and therefore it can only act through proxies. And therefore, normally, if a corporation does something questionable, legally questionable, considering the veil of corporate fiction, the one that you should hold accountable is the natural person who actually committed the deed. Okay? Like for example, merong isang officer ng korporasyon na pumunta sa isang settlement. Sabi niya, magsilayas na kayo dito. Magsilayas na kayo dito. Dahil ito ay lupain na nabili ng aming korporasyon. Sa susunod, binibigyan ko kayo ng 5 araw. Kapag hindi kayo umalis, sa susunod na pagbalik ko dito, may dala na akong pulis. At pinapangako ko sa inyo na hindi kami maaawa kahit na may mga babae at bata pa kayo. So naglapag ng ganung threat. Ngayon, ang ginawa ng barangay is sila yung naunang makipag-coordinate sa police. So pinablatter nila yung incident and they attempted to sue the corporation. Because ang sabi nung taong pumunta, di ba, ang lupang ito ay lupa na ng korporasyon namin. Ngayon, ang sabi ng korporasyon, no, yung officer na yan, yes, we admit, officer namin yan. But he acted on his own personal accord. Oops, di ba? And therefore, if the officer acted by himself without the imprimatur of the corporation, then of course, no, what would follow? It is that officer who should be personally liable for his actions. And therefore, the veil would not be breached or would not be pierced. But, no, sometimes, the veil of corporate fiction is taken advantage of by insidious elements, by persons who want to do no good. And therefore, the veil is used to perpetrate fraud, to defeat public convenience, to justify the commission of a wrong, or to defend crime. Now, this fiction shall be disregarded, and the individuals composing it will be treated identically. No? This is a judicial function. Mga nagtatago sa likod ng korporasyon para gumawa ng kalokohan. Kasi alam nila na hindi sila masasampahan ng kaso. Okay? The directors who try to hide behind their corporate officers. Oh, so that's the first example I gave. Another example would be, no? Nag-joyride, no? Nag-joyride yung isa sa mga corporate officers ginamit yung sasakyan ng korporasyon. Nakainom, no? Pumunta sa beer house. Tapos, against all better judgment, while drunk, he drove, no? Remember, don't drink and drive. Especially may liquor ban na yata, no? I think in place na yata. But anyway, no? Lasing, minaneho yung service vehicle noong korporasyon. May nasagasaan. No? Sa halip na tulungan, syempre nagpanik si tanga, hit and run. No? Kita niya nasagasaan niya sa halip na babain niya o kaya tumawag ng first responder. No? Wala. Hit the accelerator, karipas. The victim did not see the morning. No? Namatay siya doon. And now, the family, no, buti na lang, yung kalsadang yun, merong, alam niyo yung sa mga ibang mga syudad na kung saan meron ng mga 24/7 na security cameras. Normally used to determine if people are committing traffic violations. Actually, nakakakota ako sa ganyan. Minsan merong dapat pala para dun sa magle-left turn pala yung lane na yun, tapos may darating na ticket dito sa bahay, 3,000, agoy. So, yun. At anyway, the point is that security camera, it was all seen on camera. Now, these cameras are very, very, very advanced, no? High resolution video captures yung nakukuha. High resolution pictures. Nakitang-kita yung plaka ng sasakyan, kitang-kita, no? Kasi sabihin natin hindi tinted yung sa may dashboard, no? So kita yung muka, at least naaninag ng konti yung muka ng driver. Na yun nga, corporate officer ng korporasyon. So syempre, being that this is a case of reckless imprudence resulting in homicide kasi may namatay na tao. Okay? Syempre, ang sinasampahan nito, person. Of course, the person who committed the reckless imprudence. Sino ba yung nakasagasa? Diba? Siya yung sasampahan ng kaso. Ngayon, ang sabi naman ito ni Tukmol, no? I am a corporate officer of Corporation X. The vehicle that was captured on camera is a corporate vehicle. It is not owned by me. It is owned by the corporation. And therefore, it should be the corporation who should stand in court. Bakit ako? I am just an officer of the corporation. And the vehicle is just a vehicle of the corporation. I am not the owner of that vehicle. It is the corporation which owns the vehicle. Because the corporation owns property, right? Is capable of owning property, right? Now, obviously, no, ini-invoke nito ni Tokmol yung veil of corporate fiction in order to try to evade criminal liability. Will that stand? Will that defense be tenable? Is that defense meritorious? Of course, the answer is a resounding or should be a resounding no, of course not. Okay? Because the veil of corporate fiction will always be disregarded if the purpose tried to be achieved is the perpetuation of fraud, the justification of wrong, the defense of a criminal act, or an attempt to defeat public convenience. Nagtatago itong nakasagasa sa veil, no, of corporate fiction. What the law allows us to do is to pierce the veil. Maglalabas ka ng punyal tapos ituturok mo, no? At dahil matalas ang punyal, syempre lulusot yun doon sa veil at tatamaan mo yung culprit doon sa likod na nagtatago. Yan. Now, this doctrine is normally invoked to make the directors, officers, and shareholders liable for the obligation of the corporation. Normally, as stated in Francisco Motors versus Court of Appeals. Kasi in corporate practice, minsan, corporate officers try to get away with ingenious plans, no, in order to pin liability for their own personal actions on the corporation. No? Na normally, if they were allowed to get away with it, the corporation would get away on a technicality. Kasi gaya nga ng na-discuss natin kanina, there are certain things that we cannot enforce against corporations. You cannot hold them liable for certain acts because they are artificial beings. However, kung malinaw yung criminal intent, no? Kung malinaw yung intent to evade liability on the part of these directors, of these officers, of these shareholders, no? We can pierce the veil and hold these persons accountable for these obligations alleged to be that of the corporation. Okay.